Okay, so today we'll talk about the relationships between the inflation rates and exchange rates. So the main two topics we cover in this chapter are, we will talk about purchasing power parity, we'll also talk about the international Fisher effect. So I think in international finance, I think the main three concepts are, one is we talked about interest rate parity. Okay, so there, the relationship between the forward price and the spot price. So that was the interest rate parity. And today we will talk about two other very important concepts. The purchasing power parity, what would be the Fisher effect. So this talks about the purchasing power parity theory and the implications for exchange rates. It talks about the international Fisher effect and the implications for exchange rates. Okay, so when we talk about the purchasing power parity, basically what it tells you is that the same basket of goods, so same set of items, so you could pick, let's say, 10 items. What we are saying is that it should have the same price all over the world. So whether you buy it in the US, whether you buy it in China, whether you buy it in Canada, and so on, the same basket of goods should have the same price all over the world. So that is what the purchasing power parity tells. Now I just want to show one illustration. Come back to that. So one of the ways people try to illustrate the purchasing power parity is, if you look at magazine Economist, they publish what is referred to as a Big Mac index. So in the Big Mac index, what they are saying is that the price of a Big Mac should be the same after you adjust for it. So in the US, I think a Big Mac sells for maybe around $4.26. And let's say you go to Canada, what we are saying is that after adjusting for the exchange rate, the same Big Mac should sell for $4.26. So that's one way to illustrate the purchasing power parity. Now here we'll talk more about some general things and so on. So the first is, why do highly inflated countries weak home currencies? That comes the purchasing power parity, and it also talks, towards the end, we'll talk about how you can put all of them together: interest rate parity, the purchasing power parity, and the international Fisher effect. Okay, so the first, let's talk about the purchasing power parity, and there are two ways to look at that. So the first is the absolute form of purchasing power parity. So there, when you talk about the absolute form of purchasing power parity, that is, we talked about. So what it says here is that without international barriers, consumers shift their demand to wherever prices are lower, and prices of the same basket of products in two different countries should be equal when measured in the common currency. So pretty much what I was telling you. When you look at the same basket of goods, so let's say you pick 10 items, that should have the same price all over the world. So that is the purchasing power parity. Now, people have looked at that, and what people find is that that definitely does not hold. Okay? So clearly, there are problems with the purchasing power parity. Can you think about some reasons why it does not hold?
Different currency.
So what the exchange rate between the US dollar and the Canadian dollar is 0.8 US dollars is equal to 1 Canadian dollar. Okay, so in this case, something that costs $5 here should cost $6.25 in Canadian dollars. So there we are adjusting. Okay? But what we find is that this is really not true. As an example, if you look at a Mercedes-Benz, $90,000 in the US, you might have to pay $180,000 in India. I'm not sure in China, maybe something close like that. So why is that? So an example would be, so taxes are across the world. So again, if you go to India, they charge 100% duty on imported cars. So that's why the price of the same car is going to be double the price in the US when you look at an imported car. I think in China too, it's very expensive. Okay? So one reason is that, and the reason why that might be happening.
And inflation effects for the currency.
Okay,
makes
so
the buying power less.
okay, so what he was saying is inflation effects. Anything else you can think about? Why things might be more expensive in other parts of the world? Exchange rates, so that is what the purchasing power parity tells. After you control for the exchange rate, it should be the same price. But why is it that even after for the exchange rate, prices tends to be higher in some places? One example would be taxes or tariffs.
Consumer demand.
It could be demand, so companies might set the price based upon the demand for the product. Anything else? What is it? Interest rate? Yeah. Huh? Inflation, I think we talked about that, yeah. Any other reasons?
The product life cycle
Product?
introduced in
Okay. So I think some of the things that, when you look at the textbook, or that could be, one is transportation cost, okay? So if you're making it in China, you want to bring it to the US, it's going to be a little more expensive simply because shipping costs. It would be consumer income. Okay? When businesses, they try to set the prices based upon consumer income and how much they can afford. So that's another reason why the prices could be different. Now here, we are talking about the effect of inflation on the currency, and we'll also talk about the effect of interest rates on the currency. So there's a lot of evidence showing that the absolute form of purchasing power parity does not work in practice. So here we have a slightly different one, that is the relative form of purchasing power parity. And what does it say? Due to market imperfections, prices of the same basket of products in different countries measured in a common currency. So there, that is the absolute form of purchasing power parity. What I have in red, it talks about the relative form of purchasing power parity. And what it tells you is that the rate of change in prices should be somewhat similar when measured in common currency as long as costs and trade barriers are unchanged. So in this case, what we are saying is that rather than look at how much the same dollar can buy, we are talking about whether the change in the inflation is related to the change in the exchange rate. So we are talking about the difference, let's say, between the US and China, the US and Canada, and so on. That is the difference in the inflation. So we are talking about the differential inflation and how it affects the exchange rate. Okay. So this is one way to look at the relationship between the change in the exchange rate and the inflation levels. So what we have on the left-hand side is the change in the exchange rate. So what we are saying is that by how much does, let's say, the euro change from one year to the other. And what we are saying here is that the change in the euro is related to the inflation in the US and the inflation in Europe. Okay, so these are what we have. So the change in the exchange rate depends upon the inflation in the US and the inflation in Europe or any other country that we are talking about. Okay? So here, change in the exchange rate is equal to 1 plus inflation in the US divided by 1 plus the inflation in foreign country. Okay, so this is what we have. Okay. So that is like a strict way to look at the purchasing power parity. You cannot see the board? Okay. Now, a simpler way is, it's an approximation, okay? This tells you that the change in the exchange rate will be equal to the difference between inflation levels of the trade. So what that means is that, let's say the inflation in the US is, okay, so the inflation in the US is, let's say 3%, and the inflation in Europe is 5%. So that's what it says here. So let's assume that the US has an inflation of 3% and Europe has an inflation of 5%. So what we are saying here is that the difference in inflation is 2%, and based upon approximation, what it tells you is that we can expect dollar to increase by 2%. And the reason being that next year, 1 year from today, the same dollar is only going to buy you 97% of what it buys today. At the same time, it's only going to buy 95% of what it buys today. Okay, so that's why we can expect, in this case, the euro to decline by 2%, or we can expect the US dollar to appreciate by the relative form of the purchasing power parity. Okay? Now, if you want to put it another way, so chances are, when you do problems and so on, we might have to put it another way. And what we need to do here, we can say that the expected spot rate, okay, divided by today's spot rate is given by 1 plus the inflation in the US divided by 1 plus the inflation in the foreign country, okay? Or so this is what you see when we look at the purchasing power parity. So what it tells you is, if you want to compare the future exchange rate, so what should be the spot exchange rate 1 year from today to today's exchange rate, that equals 1 plus the inflation in the US divided by 1 plus the inflation in the foreign country. Or essentially what it tells you is that if you know today's exchange rate, if you know the inflation in the US, and if you know the inflation in the foreign country, we can at least try to predict what the future is. And that is given by today's exchange rate in the US by 1 plus the inflation in the foreign country. Okay? Now, it's been a while since you came back to class, but what does it remind you of? What does it look like? But what is the difference? Okay, so that's good. So basically here, what is the big difference? I think in the last class, we talked about the interest rate parity. And in the case of the interest rate parity, what we said was F by S, okay, is given by 1 plus the interest rate in the US divided by 1 plus the interest rate in the foreign country. So this was the purchasing power parity. So in the case of the purchasing power parity, we had the spot rate. Here also we have the spot rate. You can write it the same way. And on the right-hand side, we had the inflation interest rate in the US and the interest rate in the foreign country. So that's what we see. And I think one more thing that we want to talk about is that here the interest rate we have, okay? So this is the nominal interest rate. And this is equal to the real rate plus the inflation. Okay, so that's what we have when we look at the relationship between the interest rate. So what we see here is that the interest rate that we have, that we usually talk about, that has two parts. One is the real rate, and the second is the inflation. So these are the two components of the interest rate. Now, usually, suppose you are a business, you are opening a new, expanding, let's say, into China or Europe or Mexico or any other country, you have to have some projections regarding your cash flows, okay? So you want to figure out how much money you're going to make, and again, you want to see how much you make, as typically in euros or whether it's pesos and so on. You have to make some projections. And then, once you have those projections, you want to bring it back into US dollars, especially if you are a US company. And most of the time, companies try to do it in two ways. One is they tend to use the forward rate as the predictor of the future spot rate. So forward prices are available. It's not too difficult to find them online. The second choice they have is they try to use purchasing power parity to forecast the future exchange rate. So these are, I think, very commonly used methods to forecast the future exchange rate. So this gives you the purchasing power parity, and here this in some ways summarizes the relationship between inflation and the exchange rates. So you are, I think we talked about this in chapter 2. So if you are in a country with relatively high local inflation, your imports will increase. You're going to buy more stuff from abroad because it's relatively cheaper. At the same time, your exports will decrease because things are more expensive in your country. People outside are not going to buy your stuff, which means that there is not much demand for your currency. At the same time, you are buying more currencies from abroad. So that talks about a non-mathematical way to see what might happen in practice and why the exchange rate of your currency should decline. Okay? So in this case, the reason being that you're going to import more stuff and you're going to import less, which means that the demand for your currency is going to be lower. Okay? That's one thing you see here. And the second reason, as we said before, scenario 2, you have low inflation. So right now in the US, inflation is pretty low. And in that case, imports will decrease, exports will increase. Okay, so things are relatively cheap. You can sell your stuff abroad, and local currency should appreciate by the same degree as the inflation differential. So that's what we talked about, the US dollar and the euro. So what we said was, in the US, the inflation is 3%. In Europe, it's 5%. We can expect the US dollar to go up by 2%. So that is what we see here in the case of scenario 2. And the last case is local and foreign inflation are similar. No impact of inflation on import or export volume, and the local currency's value is not affected. So what we are saying here is that if the inflation is 3% in the US and 3% in Europe, the exchange rate should be unchanged. That is what the purchasing power parity tells you. Okay? basically illustrates the relationship between the change in the exchange rate and the difference in the inflation. So what we have here is the difference in inflation between the US and the, so let's say it's US and Europe, that is the difference in the inflation. And on the right-hand side, we have the change in the exchange rate. Now, what do we see here? Basically, what it tells you is that for point A, the difference in the inflation is, how much is that? Around 4%, okay? The US inflation, let's say it's 4% higher than the inflation in Europe. What it tells you is that we can expect the US dollar to go down by 4%. Okay, so that's what you see here. That tells you basically we have a straight line. On the other hand, if you look at point B, what we are saying is the inflation in the US is 5% lower than the inflation in Europe, and in that case, the currency should appreciate by that amount. So that is basically, intuitively speaking, that is the relationship between inflation differences and exchange rates. Okay. Now here, if you look at point C, what does it tell you about the currency? Is the currency properly valued? Is it overvalued, undervalued? What is Why is that?
Because last that is 1% inflation is 1% is changes in foreign currency. We have the 1, but C is above the line.
So if you look at the changes, what it tells you is the inflation in the US is higher than the inflation in the foreign country by 4%. Yes, that's what you have, which means that the change in the exchange rate should be a decline of 4%. Okay, so the US dollar should decline by 4% against the foreign currency. But what we see here is that the change is only 1%. Okay, so rather than decline by 4%, the currency declined only by 1%. So that's a very good answer. What we are saying here is that C did not change as much as implied by the inflation changes. Okay. Now here, for point D, what we see is that the difference in the inflation is only 2%, okay, and it's 2% lower in the US. In spite of that, the change in the exchange rate is a decline of 3%. Okay, so again, that is not consistent with what we predict. Okay? So what do you think about this? So based upon the purchasing capacity, what do you think should happen to currencies? For example, Israel, the inflation is double digit, okay? Russia, again, is double digit, and so on. What do you think should happen to those currencies? So what it predicts is that if the difference is 10%, we should expect the currency to decline by 10%. Okay, so we should expect very decrease the value of the currency. Now, unfortunately, we'll look at some graphs and so on. What we find is that there's a high chance the purchasing power parity does not hold in practice. Okay, so the purchasing power parity may not hold in practice. Why do you think that may not hold? What are some of the reasons why? It predicts that if Russia has 5% inflation, you would expect the Russian currency to decline by 25%. But that does not happen. Yeah. One is that governments have control. So in China, the currency is very tightly controlled by the government. That's one example. Anything else? Any other ways why which? Yeah. Speculation?
People will be doing a lot of trade. People would want to hedge their receivables vehicles. That would have.
Okay, I think it's it's a little bit at least consistent with the purchasing power parity.
The biggest one is government.
Yeah. Any other ways by which one way is to stop the free movement. Any other way, governments can perhaps control the exchange rate.
interest rate.
So they could be using perhaps try to control interest rates in any reason. Okay, so other ways, at least temporarily, for example, if you look at Russia now, they have very high, and the currency has gone down quite a bit, but not as much as predicted by the purchasing power parity and so on. And the reason being that the governments may not allow the free movement of currency, the governments may not allow free imports from outside and so on, so that they don't want the currency to decline as much as predicted by these models. So that's what we see. And so government controls, even if inflation increases, the foreign demand will not necessarily decrease. The other thing is, perhaps more important, is that, for example, if you look at China, when compared with 5 years back, the labor costs are much higher. So people, some of the factories, they are striking. So because of that, the salaries have gone up, the wages have gone up, and which also means that inflation has gone up. But what we see here, as predicted by the purchasing power parity and so on, one of the reasons why the exchange rate has not changed, one reason could be the government controls. The second reason is that if you look at the US or perhaps other countries, they don't have much choice. Although prices have gone up, still things are really cheap when you import from China. So that's the reason why it talks about substitutes are not available. So China was a very good deal maybe 10 years back, but China is still a good deal in spite of the increase in the wages and in spite of the increase in the cost. So that's one of the reasons why the currency is still stable, there is still a demand, and so on. Okay. Now, this talks about, this is, perhaps you can get some problem like this as far as the exam is concerned. So here, as of today, assume the following information is available. The real rate of interest required for investors is 2% in the US and Mexico, and the nominal interest rate is 11% and 15%. Okay? The spot rate is 0.2, the 1-year forward rate is 0.19. Okay, so this is what you have. This is the information you have. Use the forward rate to forecast the percentage change in the Mexican peso over the next year. So how can we predict the forward premium or the forward discount? So how do you do that here? So what is the forward premium or discount? And the second part, perhaps more like what you can expect, is use the differential in expected inflation over the next year. So there, what we are talking about is that we can use perhaps this formula or this relationship to predict the future spot rate. Okay, so this is what we need to do. You want to predict or you want to forecast the future spot rate. Okay, so the first part is pretty straightforward. I think we did it some time back. What is the forward premium or discount? And in this case, the spot rate is 0.2, the 1-year forward rate is 0.19. Okay? So how do you figure out the forward premium or discount? So that is given by F minus S over X. Okay? So the forward price minus the spot exchange rate divided by the spot exchange rate, that gives you the forward premium or discount. So here, that is like a discount, isn't it? 5%? Yeah. So that's what we get. Now, what about the second part? Use the differential in expected inflation to forecast the change in the Mexican peso over the next year. Anybody want to have an answer? That'd be great. So basically, you want to use this relationship to forecast the future spot rate. So what do you think would be the answer if you try to forecast the future spot rate? I think that, what is the inflation here? That's the first part, you know. So I think that
And you have the nominal rate, so
Yeah.
it's equal real rate plus inflation.
so I think that yeah, that's good. Okay.
1 plus 9.
So the main thing here is you want to find out the inflation first, okay? And to find out the inflation, this is what you have. The nominal rate is given by the real rate plus the inflation, okay? And in this case, the real rate in both countries is 2%. So what that means is that the inflation in the US is 11 minus percent, and the inflation in Mexico is 15 minus 15%. Okay, so once we have that, we can find out the future spot rate. Okay, so that's what we have. So this tells us that the expected spot rate is given by. Okay, this is. They make it a little bit different. I'd like to use it this way, but this is 0.2. Okay, times 1.09 divided by 1.13. But for this question, the way they put it might be a little bit easier because you can directly get the change in the exchange rate. But if you're asked to predict the future spot rate, this is a little bit easier because you directly get this spot rate. So in some ways it depends on the question. But here, what it says is that the differential in expected inflation to forecast the change in the Mexican peso over the next year. And how do we do that? Basically, this is the formula we are using. The change in the exchange rate is given by 1 plus the inflation in the US divided by 1 plus the inflation in the foreign country minus 1. Okay? So here, the only thing we had to find out was the inflation in the US and the inflation in Mexico. So that was 9% in the US and 13% in Mexico. And we already talked a little bit about this. So the opening of Russia's market has resulted in a highly volatile Russian currency, the ruble. Russia's inflation has commonly exceeded 20% per month, and Russia's interest rates commonly exceed 150%, but this is sometimes less than the annual inflation rate in Russia. Okay? So what we see here explain why the high Russian inflation has put severe pressure on the Russian ruble, and does the effect of Russian inflation value support the purchasing power parity? How might the relationship be distorted by political conditions in Russia? So I think the first part is reasonably straightforward. Yeah? What is the answer there? So what do you think about the relationship between the ruble and inflation? So that is there. So there is consistent with the purchasing power parity. So if Russia has 150% basically they have very high inflation, let's say it's 100%, based upon the purchasing power parity, we should expect the Russian currency to decline by maybe 100%. Okay? That is what is predicted by the purchasing power parity. Now the question here is that why is it that we don't see that in practice? Although I think last year it declined, yeah? Like half or something? That's what the students were saying. In my undergrad class, I have 2 students from Russia, so I think they're saying it went down by 50%. But if you are in Ukraine, I think it went down by 67%. Yeah. It became a third last year. So what that means is that, if your parents are paying you money to come to UMass Dartmouth, the fees tripled in your currency. So what do you think about this here? Why is that we don't see such big changes in the currency?
Didn't the government buy a bunch of rubles and try to buy their own currency?
Yes, Yes, so I think some of the reasons are, as far as Russia is concerned, they will perhaps ban imports or, at least limit imports and so on, which means that there is not much free movement of the currency. So, but one of the things that happened was, after the oil prices fell, so if you were, let's say, a company like Audi or Jaguar and so on, you were selling a lot of cars in Russia because, there are a lot of very wealthy people also in Russia. And what happened was, for I think 2 or 3 days, those companies stopped sales of their cars. And simply because they were not sure about what was going to happen to the exchange rate. So that's one example. And this year, beginning of the year, that took place because it was so dramatic, the decline in the Russian currency. Okay? So some of the reasons we see here, so it may not move exactly as specified by the purchasing power parity, and the main reason is that political conditions can restrict trade or currency convertibility. So even if people want to buy stuff from abroad, the government may not allow free trade of that. Okay? That's one thing. That's one of the reasons why it may not decline as much as predicted by purchasing power parity. Okay? Now, here is, I think we'll come back to this. It talks about the international Fisher effect. So, what are some of the ways in which people have tested the purchasing power parity? So, it talks about the conceptual test of purchasing power parity and what are some of the results of that. So, this is what you see as far as the results are concerned. So, here we have 4 currencies, and for all 4 currencies, the graphs show that if you look at the relationship, somewhat like this. So there, basically what it tells you is that the purchasing power parity tells you that you have a line relationship between the differential inflation and the exchange rates. But in reality, you do not find it. You find more like a cluster, which basically to say that all said and done, the purchasing power parity does not seem to be holding. Okay? So what are some of the reasons? Is confounding effect. So as some of you pointed out, there could be a lot of things going on. So in the case of Russia, the currency is falling, high inflation is there, but another big reason is the big decline in the oil prices. So that can complicate things. So usually there could be more than one factor that affects the exchange rate. So that's what we see here. And the second one, I think we already talked about that, that is no substitutes for. So now